morning and good afternoon to you all, from those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another video talking about the settlement of Darwin, previously called Palmerston. In today's video, I hope to talk to you about some of the buildings and landmarks within the city and the general development of this fledgling colony in the late 19th century. So let's get started with a little bit of a recap. Okay, so George Goyder came over to Darwin from South Australia and arrived on the 9th of February 1869. He developed the city, the streets, the water sources and the food and etc. He left by the end of that year and a full proper legislative council was enforced in June 1870. Right, let's go. Now Darwin was deliberately designed and constructed to create a new network of communications, a telegraph system that would connect Australia, which had its own system inbuilt, to the rest of the British Empire and the rest of the wider world. You see, John McDowell Stuart's journey through the centre of Australia in 1862 wasn't a mere exploratory expedition. It was about finding a route through the centre to create this overland telegraph network from the central hub in Adelaide to the most northerly point, now called Palmerston, to connect to the wider Europe and the world. So a year after George Goyder left his new settlement creation, and a few short months after the introduction of a proper legislative council in Palmerston, so we're talking late 1870, the first shipment of equipment and provisions, and including obviously construction workers, were brought to the new settlement, ready to construct this overland telegraph network. All was said and done and everything completed and constructed by the late August of 1872, with the first messages with London being sent by October. Pictured here is the first telegraph pole of this telegraph network, installed at Port Darwin on the 15th of September 1870. You can just about see it because it's in amongst all of these bushes. It would have originally been constructed out of wood, but because of the termite problem in the Northern Territory, they were soon replaced with steel, proper iron poles. This telegraph pole was also constructed next to the administrative offices of Darwin, which are some of the earliest constructed buildings from the 1870s and 80s. The original administrative offices were constructed out of timber in 1870, but were updated to a more substantial and termite-proof stone from 1883 by the architect John George Knight. Knight is attributed to a number of the earliest buildings constructed within Darwin, not just the administrative office and its associated police station and cell block. Knight constructed the government residence, which is across the road from the administrative building. It was constructed from 1884 and replaced the old 1876 timber building that had been largely constructed by the Chinese immigrant workers. He is also associated with constructing what is now called the Knight's Folly. Now this was a building reserved for public servants, just down the cliff from the government residence. However, it doesn't survive anymore, having been burnt down in 1933, but is still marked by a plaque at the bottom of the cliff to recognise Knight's contributions not only to the Folly, but also to the wider early building works of Darwin. Other buildings attributed to Knight include a courthouse, a number of business warehouses, of which only one remains, called the Brown's Mart, and of course the Palmerston Town Hall, which is now in these ruins. One thing that came about due to the construction of the telegraph network, and which would develop the settlement of Palmerston, now Darwin, to an even greater lengths, was the discovery of gold in the Northern Territory. So during the mid-1870s, there was a huge surge in people coming over from Europe to mine the fields that were in the Northern Territory. And with all the money being made from these mines, were going back into the settlements around those mines, but also into the settlement of Palmerston because of its developing port section and because of its routes and trades with the rest of the world, not least because of the new overland telegraph network, which made communication much simple and much easier and faster with, again, the rest of the world. Now, although Darwin was considered to be a deliberately designed settlement for the use of the overland telegraph network, it was also a key and important port city as well. Now, despite a number of deliveries being made to Darwin with telegraph network equipment, a proper wharf at the port of Darwin was not constructed until 1872. And it was called the Stokes Wharf after John Lort Stokes, who had seen Darwin on the HMS Beagle in 1839. Now, with this new wharf, it gave a rise to more sort of satellite communities being set up in the wider Port Darwin area. Communities that still, to this day, heavily rely on the shipping industry that Darwin offers and brings. Now, another major industry that came about with the construction of this wharf was the pearling industry that was set up around the mid-1880s. Now, what is pearling as an industry? Well, it is the cultivation of oyster pearls, as well as mother of pearl, which is the underside, the inside of the actual oyster shell. It is a very profitable industry within Darwin, and one of the major headquarters for the pearling industries are still based in the Darwin Central Business District. But the pearling industry would come to a slight halt on the 6th of January 1897, when a devastating cyclone hit the settlement, coinciding with large high tides. Of the 29 ships used by the pearling industry, often called luggers, 18 of them were destroyed in the effects of the high tides and the cyclone that day. And it wasn't until about 1902, some 5 years later, that the industry was able to recover and go back to its full capacity and build from there. 15 people would lose their lives to the cyclone of 1897, mostly on the lugger ships that were in the pearling industry. Newspapers would call the event a night of terrifying destructiveness, as well as a gentle reminder from Providence that we are a very vulnerable people. Despite this cyclone, the Palmerston settlement, now Darwin, managed to pick itself back up and to rebuild with great effect, going from strength to strength throughout the 20th century, despite a number of other events, weather and war, devastating Darwin as well. Now, probably the ultimate influence on Darwin is probably this Palmerston Town Hall. It is a physical representation of the history of Darwin itself. It was constructed in 1883, like many of the other buildings associated with John George Knight. It was a public building, of course, but suffered a great amount of damage in 1897 thanks to a large cyclone. With the repairs made, into the 20th century, it remained a public building until about 1937. In 1937, the Palmerston Town Hall, like many other public buildings at Port Darwin, were handed over to the Australian Navy, who were building and preparing for an oncoming attack by the Japanese forces. Damage was done again to the Town Hall building on the 19th of February 1942, with the major bombing of Darwin and the first attack by the Japanese during the Second World War. The building remained in the Navy's hands until 1959, in between which the war had come to a conclusion and a lot of the major construction work to rebuild the city, including the town hall, were done. The building then began preparations for a new purpose. In 1968, it was opened up as a museum and was open right up until the very end of 1974. Christmas 1974 was another devastating blow to not only the town hall building, but to the entire city itself, as Cyclone Tracy, one of the most powerful cyclones ever recorded to hit Darwin, completely destroyed the majority of the city and, of course, the town hall building. But since Cyclone Tracy struck, The Palmerston Town Hall has been left in a ruinous state and has not been reconstructed. But it is still, like I mentioned earlier in the video, it is probably the physical representation of the history of Darwin, having seen many a cyclone, a bomb, and a social change within its walls and within the wider communities and city itself. And that about concludes this video on the early development of Darwin. Probably quite a short video compared to the ones I've made before, but I hope that you have enjoyed it all the same. And I hope to see you next week for another Wednesday weekly video on Australian history. See you later.